This is Tom Jackson. It is June 4th, 2009. We're at the Two Live Oak Center in Atlanta, interviewing a going back interview with President Emeritus Charles B. Knapp. Dr. Knapp, let's go back to where it started. Can you tell us about where you grew up and what your childhood was like?
I basically grew up in Iowa. I was born in Iowa and went to elementary and secondary schools there in Ames, which is where Iowa State is, and went to Iowa State as an undergraduate. Had a great experience there. It's a more of a technical school than a liberal arts school, and I think it gave me a very strong background in math and science, which I promptly took and went to graduate school in economics at the University of Wisconsin. But the quantitative background, those technical skills served me very well in graduate school. Graduated from Wisconsin. By that time, Lynn and I had actually married when we were at Iowa State. Our daughter was born in Madison. And then started a academic and public sector journey across America, I guess.
What are some of the places that you worked in the early years?
Well, my first teaching job was the University of Texas at Austin. And I remember getting on a plane in Madison for the interview in Madison, Wisconsin, to be interviewed at University of Texas, and it was January or February, and it was below zero, and the wind was whipping across the Madison, Wisconsin airport, and I got off the plane in Austin, and it was 70 degrees, and the sun was shining, and it hit me right then that people don't have to live up there in the winter, and we really have not gone any further north after that than Washington, D.C. I was on the faculty at Austin for 5 years. We loved it. Lynn and I often talk about the fact that if things had turned out differently, we would probably still be in Austin. It still is a wonderful place, but it was particularly wonderful then before it was discovered by a lot of people. But I worked when I was at Texas. The fellow that had hired me when he was chairman of the economics department was Ray Marshall, and Ray was named Secretary of Labor by Jimmy Carter when he was elected. And by December of 1976, I was in Washington working for the Carter-Mondale transition team. Worked with Ray as his special assistant for a couple of years, and then had told both Ray and others in the administration that I really would like to have something with direct responsibility before the end of the term. I was thinking in those days of just serving out the first term. Of course, that turned out just to be one term.
Right.
But and what they visited on me was the Employment and Training Administration of the Labor Department, which some of the listeners may remember the CETA system, which was didn't have exactly the best reputation as delivering efficient government services. Basically what's now called the workforce system, and my title back in the days before they were stripped free of gender bias was the manpower administrator back in those days. And I remember one of the, it was actually Griffin Bell, who I'd gotten to know when I was at the Labor Department. He was Attorney General, said when I was named the manpower administrator, he said, I thought Ray Marshall liked you. It was a very controversial agency, but what it did was to give me a background other than academics and being a staff person, which I was when I worked for Ray Marshall. It was a big federal agency of $15 billion budget and 2,000 or 3,000 federal employees. And when I came out of the Carter administration, I think I was changed by the experience that I frankly found it difficult to lock the door and write for 5 hours, which scholars need to do. And relatively quickly ended up a year and a half later as the executive vice president of Tulane. And I was there until '87 when I was selected as president of the University of Georgia.
Now, back in Iowa, tell us a bit about the family that you grew up around.
Well, you know, the legend, and it actually has the advantage of being true, is that I had a number of ancestors that were college and university presidents. The second president of Iowa State was Seaman Ashale Knapp, who would be my great-great-grandfather. And he was, he actually later went on to greater notoriety as widely viewed as being the father of the Cooperative Extension Service. That would be 20 years after he left Iowa State. And then I had another great-grandfather, Albert B. Storms. We actually share a middle name. He's Albert Boynton Storms, and I'm Charles Boynton Knapp. And he was president of Iowa State around maybe the first decade of the 20th century, maybe 1900 to 1910. My grandmother was actually raised in the president's house at Iowa State. And another relative, and this is the real skeleton in my closet that I never really admitted when I was at UGA, was my uncle Bradford Knapp, who was president, and I'm just going to say he was president of Alabama Polytechnical Institute in the 1920s, but
Forerunner of
Auburn University. Right. And I always tried to fuzz that up whenever anybody asked me about that, because I didn't know if people would interpret that correctly. But it actually, you know, I found out more about them after I became a college president. It was hard to escape in Ames. I mean, there were streets named after Knapp and Storms, and the arch between two buildings of the agriculture department is the Knapp Arch. Very few families have arches named after them.
Right.
That's a kind of a distinction, but that was really as a result of his work with what became the Cooperative Extension Service.
Does it give you the personal sense that it might be in the genes?
I guess it could, but I really don't. I don't believe that. As I was saying, I really found out a lot more about the ancestors, the specifics of it. You know, when you're a young man growing up in Iowa, you're actually you don't really want to talk about the fact that street was named after your great-great-grandfather. Your friends would ridicule you, so I actually kind of avoided it at Iowa State. Although I remember when I was a fraternity pledge, some of the actives in the chapter found out about it, and they had a good old time with that. But you know, I think what it did do, and maybe this was a less direct than a kind of a DNA effect, is that the sort of reverence for higher education was very much part of the family. I mean, both my parents and all four of my grandparents, which is more unusual, are graduates of Iowa State. And so they would have been graduates in the early part of the 20th century when relatively few people went to college. So that part was in the family bloodline about understanding the value of higher education.
So you're in your administrative position at Tulane. How did UGA come onto your horizon?
Well, I had been at Tulane about 5 years and had decided, and really had a great experience. I was learning from a very wise university president, Eamon Kelly, who is still a great friend of mine and lives in New Orleans and is doing wonderful things. He ended up serving 17 years as president of Tulane and really changed the institution. And watching Eamon and learning from him on the kind of panoply of the issues you've got to face and the tasks you need to undertake particularly as a research university president, was a great experience, and I think it made me better prepared, but it also frankly gave me a kind of a thirst for doing it. So I had begun to respond positively to the invitations that I would get occasionally to put my name in the hat for a college presidency. And the contact with Georgia was actually Eamon to Elridge McMillan, who we're now in 2009, and that was 22 or 23 years ago, and Elridge is still on the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia. I think the longest serving regent in history, and Eamon had known Elridge, and Elridge was coming to coming to New Orleans for a meeting, and I had been contacted, I guess, by the search firm about the opening, but hadn't really responded to it. And Eamon set up a meeting at one of the downtown hotels with Elridge, and we had a good talk. And he reaffirmed a lot of the things that were forming in my mind about Georgia, and it was shortly after that I applied.
And so that influenced you to take the job when the offer came? What were the things that influenced you to take the job?
I thought that a couple of things about the university. One was it had just gone through a traumatic period with the Jan Kemp affair, and I think it's important when you see an institution that does something like that to kind of look through the fog of what had gone on, and a lot of people were still looking at the fog and they weren't paying attention to the underlying strengths of the university. I thought the University of Georgia was a lot better institution than it was perceived as being. I mean, to this day, there's still a kind of a snobbery in higher education about Southern universities. It'll take a long time longer to get that done. But I knew from having been at Tulane that there were really distinguished faculty at Georgia, that for a university without an engineering school or a medical school, that they were very strong in the basic sciences and had a lot of sponsored research. And I also had a sense that turned out to be correct, that the university was really in the orbit of Atlanta, and that Atlanta was going to be an engine that would move a lot of things forward in the coming years. So when you took all that together, it just seemed like a really good opportunity. And then as I began to meet the people that were involved, I became even more convinced that that assessment was correct.
What do you recall about your first physical visit to the campus? What did you see? What did you expect?
It was interesting because the end of the search took a kind of a twist that none of us really could have anticipated. I had been for a couple of interviews, maybe 3 interviews, and Lynn had been at least in on one of those interviews. We actually interviewed in the old CNS Bank building downtown here in Atlanta, which is now the Georgia State Business School. Mm-hmm. But irony being what it is, that's all right. And I had kind of thought we were, given the rhythm of a search and knowing what I knew about it, maybe another interview away or maybe a phone call away from saying, now we're going to do a beauty pageant on the campus, or the way these things usually conclude, particularly at public universities. And I had been involved in a search at another university that was a little bit ahead of that. And I'm told by folks that were involved in that the search committee and the chancellor, who was Dean Probst at the time, became aware of that and decided that they needed to strike fast. So I was sitting in my office. I'd never been to Athens. I'd been to Atlanta many times, but I was sitting in my office at Tulane one morning, and Chancellor called me and offered me the job, subject to Board of Regents approval. And Lynn and I had talked about it enough to know that that was really our first choice. So and you don't want to seem like you're plagued by self-doubt at a moment like that. So I just swallowed hard and said, yes, I'm sure we'll be able to work out the details. So we did, and we flew to early morning flight, maybe 6 o'clock out of New Orleans, flew to Atlanta. I remember, unfortunately, I got to Eamon Kelly was aware of it, but nobody else at Tulane was, and I got to the airport, and 3 of my direct reports were right there on the same flight, wondering why Lynn and I were headed to Atlanta. We got here and were secreted in the back passage to Governor Joe Frank Harris's office, and we spent some time with the governor and his staff, which at that point included Gracie Phillips, who great friend of ours. Gracie and Barry have been great friends of ours ever since. And I did a press conference with the Board of Regents, which included Elridge was there, and Dean Probst was there, and Art Gentilette, who ran Savannah Light and Power for years, was there. And then we went to Athens. I mean, by this time I'm pretty well committed, right? I've already done the press conference, met the governor, and so on, and we drove on over to Athens, and of course, fell in love with the town immediately. But I guess it was a little bit of a risky thing to take the job sight unseen. I was comfortable with the research I had done about the university and the number of people I'd talked to. So I believe there weren't any great surprises, and there weren't.
You remember what you thought when you toured the campus? That among those first times, what was your impression of the physical campus?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being overwhelmed by the number of the scale of the facilities, and it was kind of one of those epiphany moments that. All right, now you've asked for it, and now you're responsible for all this.
The dog who caught the car.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm not a person that again, looks backward too often, but I guess we all have kind of moments like that where you think, wow. And that was kind of one of those wow moments for me, was that first tour of the campus. I don't think it was the first time we were there. It may have been the next visit or whatever that we did a kind of a comprehensive tour of the campus. Now, Tom, we can't let this pass without the story of that first night, which you may remember.
The first interview on Atlanta television.
The first interview, and there was this brash reporter who was following me all day from Channel 11, WXIA TV, named Tom Jackson. You were kind of with us all day, and as we moved from place to place and had a press conference at Lou Straw House and with the indomitable Henry King Stanford and others, and had a big dinner at the president's home that Henry and Ruth Stanford hosted for us. Turned out to be good friends there. And at the end of it, I think it may have been Larry Dendy said, Tom Jackson is just being relentless about getting you on the 11 o'clock news live from Athens. At that point, XIA had a studio in a little building downtown that looked out over the arch. I'm sure you remember it. So Lynn said, I'm going to bed. She did. And at 11 o'clock, we're over there in the studio. And you were with me, and we're looking into a camera. And John Pruitt, and who was the other anchor? I can't remember.
I remember John.
Yeah, John was, in fact, John and I are now neighbors in terms of where we live in North Georgia, so I see him all the time. We laugh about this. But anyway, it's 11 o'clock at night, and I've been up, remember, since, I got a 6 o'clock flight out of New Orleans, so this has been a pretty long, kind of intense day with a lot of questions and interviews, and I'm starting to fade a little bit. So anyway, I'm talking to John as we do the countdown to 11 o'clock, and they're going to lead with me from Athens with the arch in the background. And John, I remember right before we went on, he said something like, don't worry, Dr. Knapp, there's only X hundreds of thousands of people that are watching this. And at that point, I did not wear glasses. I wore contact lenses. And at the very strike of the hour at 11, one of my contacts went off center, and we're live. And I'm sitting there the whole interview with John Pruitt going like this, twitching and trying to rub the contact back on, and so I could see everybody down in Clayton County saying, look, Martha, they hired a guy with a twitch. I mean, it was bizarre, and John and I still laugh about that moment. But that was the first time I met you.
Do you remember what happened? I came to pick you up in the news car, and I took you back over to the president's house. Do you remember what happened?
Yeah, they wouldn't let us in.
They didn't know who these two people were.
They said, "Who are you?" And we had to.
I remember the young university police officer being introduced to the new president.
Yeah, we had to talk our way past security, particularly the fact I was going in the house and everybody else was asleep. I can't remember if we had to wake Henry up or not, but he probably would not have minded.
I think he finally came to the door and saved us from the police officer.
I think that's right, yeah.
Also, on one of those early tours, you went through the Fine Arts Building.
Yeah.
And had an immediate impression of it.
Well, now I think as we speak, it is under renovation finally. And I'm sure when it was built as a WPA project during the Depression, and I'm sure at one point it was a fine facility, but by the late 1980s it was not satisfactory. And I already had begun to kind of think about how you balance different strengths of the university, and what was becoming clear to me as I looked at the Fine Arts Building, which really was, there were practice rooms, quote unquote, in the basement that were really just kind of cubicles where even I'm smart enough about music to know that you couldn't really have a serious practice session down there. And the main auditorium itself had been renovated so many times it bore, I think, little resemblance to the original
done
construction.
In the black box style.
Yeah, it was not a pretty place. I began to think about the fact that to balance the university, that a performing and visual arts center complex would be something we ought to do, and began talking about that immediately. That this, there were a lot of wonderful facilities at the university, but that facility in particular was just inadequate for a great university.
And that led to the development of the Fulton East Campus complex.
Yeah, we kept working on that, and those were that, along with the Ramsey Center, were the initial buildings on East Campus.
Your early days had to be colored by the recent controversy with the Jan Kemp case, as you mentioned. You had issues with athletics, you had issues with developmental studies. I'm sure you were getting a lot of advice from people both within and without the university. Can you speak to some of how that surrounded you in your first year or so?
Sure, yeah. Actually, I might take you back to a story during the search. The search committee was an eclectic group. I mean, it was chaired by Sid Smith, who was on the Regents, retired federal judge from Gainesville. But we had everything from former quarterbacks to members of the arts and sciences faculty that had led the charge, really against Fred Davidson, and so there was a lot of dissonance in the search committee. I remember one discussion that maybe went on for an hour, with the search committee about athletics, and I'd had some experiences with athletics. They reported to me at Tulane, and I thought we'd had a really good discussion about it, kind of talking about the balance that was necessary to run a competitive intercollegiate athletic program was about, and to do it in a way that was consistent with the mission of the university. And I remember it concluded, and Judge Smith said, "Well, that was a good discussion, Chuck." And I said, "Well, thank you, Judge." And he said, "I got one more thing to say to you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "We want to win." So, I kind of took that to heart as part of it, and always did. But it was a time of I think Henry King Stanford had done a good job of kind of pouring some oil on the waters, but there was an underlying still sense of tension and a lot of people concerned about the direction of the university and the reputation of the university coming out of the Jan Kemp affair. And I really set out to do two things right away. One was to stop talking, I believe I used the term wallowing, in the Kemp affair. And I did everything I could, both in substance and symbol, to do that. I don't know if you recall that there was a lot of heat to film a movie about it, and they wanted to film it on campus. And I said, we're not going to do that, because we're just not going to. We're not looking in the back. We're looking in the front, and this doesn't help us look in the front. In terms of that issue, which was most important, is looking forward. What I tried to do was to establish what was important. And what was important was that the University of Georgia had an opportunity to take its place among the great public universities of the country. And that's what we need to keep our eye on. And that athletics was an important part of that. I'm still a rabid bulldog. I will admit it. I live and die with the University of Georgia athletic teams to this day. But what we've got to keep in mind is that's only part of the university, and in fact, and this used to drive people crazy when I said it's not the most important part. Our most important part is teaching, research, and public service. And a strong athletics program can be a great benefit to the university. It can bring people together, it can build enthusiasm, it can be a portal that people enter the university through that otherwise would not be available. But that we've got to keep our eye on the ball. And I think a lot of people that were athletically inclined interpreted that as a de-emphasis of athletics, and that did cause a lot of, we had to do a lot of talking with people about that in the first few years. And I tried to explain what I was up to. I tried to be clear. I was clear with the regents in the hiring process that that my priorities were academic, and that's where we were going to take the university, because I thought that Georgia, as a state that was and still is on the rise, deserved a comprehensive public university that could compete with places like Virginia and North Carolina. And I think we've reached that objective. But it did not come without breaking a few eggs in the process.
It's a small fraternity, the folks who have been president of the University of Georgia, and I know you worked with both Fred Davison and Henry King Stanford over the years. Share with me a bit about your sense of each of those gentlemen and the foundation they laid for what you were able to build upon.
Well, I really had an excellent relationship with Fred, and a lot of people probably would be surprised by that, because there was, to some extent, some fussiness, I will say, between our lieutenants at various times. Surrogates would get on each other.
Present company not included.
I hope so. But Fred was always there for advice for me, and there were a lot of times I would call him or just have a quiet breakfast with him and try to get him to unlock mysteries. I mean, this is a fellow that had been president of the university for almost 20 years, and he knew a lot about the university and where it stood, and had a very good sense of academic excellence, and was was a very valuable advisor, but he was also very quiet about it. And I learned from him, I think above all others, the way a former president should behave. I mean, Fred never would comment on what was going on at the university, never say anything. If there was a policy issue, he had something to say, he'd call me and we'd talk about it, but he never would go into the press about it. And I always, I was very grateful for that, because that's really how it, I think it should be. You don't need, especially since he was for a few years before he moved to Augusta on the faculty of the vet school, you didn't need the president out there, former president out there, second guessing you all the time. And Fred never did that.
His great legacy may be setting the university on the course toward the life sciences.
Well, I think it was, and that would be I think if you again look at the big macro accomplishment, I think Fred even more generally set us on the course of being a great research university. I mean, that was in place, and the life sciences, the biosciences were the areas he emphasized, but there were a lot of strengths particularly in those areas when I got to the university. So I think Fred needs to be given all the credit for that.
And Dr. Stanford?
Well, Henry, it was a little bit different. Of course, he was there really less than a year, but just the right person at the right time. I mean, the university was traumatized, and Henry was the doctor, psychiatrist maybe. And as he so often said, he went from Raven's Gap to Tybie's Light. I can still hear him saying it. From Athens to Rome, and spread the gospel. And he really did a remarkable job. He was a remarkable man. As we speak today, it was just a few months ago that we were in Americus for his funeral service, and I really admired the job that he did at multiple universities, particularly the University of Miami, which I think is kind of what prepared him to help in a place like Georgia. He set the right tone, and really, interim university's a ocean liner, and you can't turn it very fast. And I think it would be overstating it to say Henry could turn the ocean liner in the brief period of time I was there, but he certainly calmed the waters around it, and in many ways made it easier for me. Now, Henry, till his last few days, always repeated for me the story that he said, well, Chuck Knapp, I used up his honeymoon. And there were days when I thought that was essentially accurate. But Henry was a piece of work, and again, for me as president, a very useful advisor, an older head that had been through it before, and could teach me things and get me to see things that I wouldn't have been able to see on my own.
You talked about the path toward improving the academic reputation. Some of the early steps you took toward that, teaching initiatives, diversity, emphasis, more collegial role for the faculty, which had not been a strength at the university.
Yeah.
If you would, please outline a bit for us your thinking of what steps were crucial in moving toward that enhanced academic reputation.
Well, my experience had been, and to this day is, that what you do is you sort of set the vision in place. You get here's where we're headed. This is what we're doing. And I know, Tom, you served on the cabinet when I was there, and I know people got tired of me talking about academic reputation, and that everything we were going to do was going to be built around that. If you had to make a judgment about an issue, whether it was a athletic issue or parking issue or a academic issue or a teaching issue or an issue of relationships with the General Assembly or whatever, that was the lens that I wanted it decided in. And we were going to do it as an issue of academic reputation, because I felt that if we could force that issue, that all the good things that would fall out of that would build the university into one of the best recognized public universities in the country. Now, what you do then is you start breaking that down into decisions you face and things that you want to happen. I thought a more collegial approach with the faculty was desirable. Faculty are going to produce more and harder for the university if they feel they've got a, excuse the pun, dog in the hunt, and they did, and they rose to that occasion. I mean, they were, with very, very few exceptions, I thought, entirely responsible in the way they assumed that the additional issues that they were given responsibility for. I made it very clear what they were responsible for and what they were advisory for, because they, at that point, would have liked to have taken over the athletic department, and I said, no, that's not, I do those administrative operational decisions and things like the athletic department. Those are my responsibility. I'll listen to what anybody's got to say, but your responsibility, which ought to be enough over here, is to build the academic programs of the university. So that was one thing. We tried to make sure in hiring faculty that we were very careful about who we hired. This isn't to say anything negative about the great faculty that were there, but what you always want to do is to raise the average quality of the faculty every time you make a hire. And we were, at the price of causing some friction with some of the department heads and so on. We focused very much on that. Bill Procasey, who came, I guess, a year after I was there, second year, because Louise McBee was the acting academic vice president for the first year. Bill always had a very strong sense of academic excellence, came from being the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois. And I came to rely very heavily on him for that particular judgment about what would build academic excellence in the departments and where did we need to make strategic hires. That was really Bill's absolute sweet spot in terms of what he understood instinctively and could advise on. So that was part of it. Teaching was part of it too. Ernest Boyer had just come up with his report on it must have been about 1985, on a new definition of scholarship that basically made the argument that trying to separate out teaching and research, which a lot of people often try to do, was not the right way to look at it. The right way to look at it was great researchers make great teachers. So we undertook a number of initiatives to try to get that to work. One was to move the very best researchers back into the classroom. And they were happy to do that. They said, gee, nobody had asked me to teach a freshman course in years. To try to establish teaching awards that weren't just plaques and pats on the back, but actually had dollars and merit pay increases attached to them. To try to make sure that we were preparing graduate students for their responsibilities in the classroom. Typically universities take graduate students and throw them into the classroom and don't give them any background or preparation at all. And I think that program is still in place at the university, where our graduate students that teach have to go through a fairly rigorous preparation before they get to the classroom. But we would think through the hiring and the flexibility we had, particularly in the good times good budget times when you were building the faculty up, and how we would go about approaching that, where the hires would make the most difference, which departments we were trying to build. We were very strategic in terms of recruiting students, because one of the indicators that faculty will look at in making a decision to come to the university, and that the general public looks at, is the quality of the students at the university. So this kind of gets lost in the fog of history, but I'm always kind of amused when people talk about, well, the Hope Scholarship built the beginning of the rise in the freshman measures like the SAT score and so on. Sorry, look at the data, not true. Fred Davidson had begun, and we accelerated a program where we were using the unrestricted money that was raised through the University of Georgia Foundation to fund merit scholarships and keep the very best students in the state. Go out and recruit them, make them feel like they were great athletes coming to the university, and get them to come. And a lot of that was already underway. In fact, my view of the Hope Scholarship when Zell Miller was elected and it was coming online was that what that would allow us to do is free those merits funds up for other programs within the university. That's one of the advantages I saw of the Hope Scholarship. I mean, we were spending, I think it was on the order of $3 million a year on merit scholarships, and that all got collapsed out by the presence of the Hope Scholarship. But that trajectory, if you look at it, had already begun by the time the Hope Scholarship came online. Hope was a wonderful thing for the university in terms of building the quality of the freshman class, but it's important to remember that that process had already begun. Well, I could go on, and those of you that are viewing this are probably afraid I will. But nonetheless, we tried to pick those points, like the construction of the East Campus, that would make a difference in the way people viewed the university, and I'd have to say that was largely successful. What happens is students and faculty like to go to a place that's on the rise, where things are getting better, and all of a sudden it was we were not a safety school. All of a sudden we were a selective school, and I'm reminded of that every spring. I think people still are under some kind of a misconception that I have anything to do with admissions at the university, but I get calls from parents of the elite high schools in Atlanta saying my son or daughter didn't get in. And I say, well, that's, it's a competitive place. They need to go to the two-year college and get themselves ready for the University of Georgia.
Another thing that you paid intense attention to in those years was the minority recruitment for the student body for a variety of reasons.
Right.
Wanting to reflect the population of the state, and you put great importance on that, and it posed some challenges, did it not?
It did. I thought the university had not done enough to kind of be a welcoming place for students, and we tried to do things both in terms of the substance and the symbols of that. Charlene Hunter Gault, who was one of the first two African American students at the university, came back and gave the commencement address the first spring I was there, and I was very purposeful about that. I wanted to make sure that particularly young African American students in the state knew we were a place that celebrated that, and wanted them to look at the University of Georgia as a welcoming place to be. And we recruited minority students, and we recruited minority faculty too, because if you're one of the few faculty or a few students, it's hard to make a case that it's a welcoming place. And there were some incidents involved in that. I got some kind of nasty letters in the mail, and some folks that would pull me aside and give me advice that we were moving too fast on that. You got to learn what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. Yeah. So we just kept moving ahead.
The court case had come along during your presidency.
That was right at the end.
Right at the end.
Or the major one was right at the end, and I think those are difficult public policy issues that I don't know that the country has ever really entirely resolved. Although Georgia was involved in that, I think it was Michigan that turned out to be the kind of flagship on those cases, and it's still an ambiguous area of public policy. I think in America, I think it's hard to sort it out to this day. What you can do and what you can't do, and what you should do and what you shouldn't do.
I was thinking back over some what you might call crisis situations that you and your senior administration had to deal with during those days. One night I recall was the night of the beginning of the first war in Iraq.
Yeah.
And we learned that students were marching across the North Quad. Do you recall that evening?
I do. And I remember going over there and meeting and talking with the students. I was really informed in that period I may not have known this at the time, but as I reflect on it, by my time as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, which was from 1968 to 72, and I watched students take out on the university their frustrations about the Vietnam War. And I could kind of see that in these students, that the students that were out there that night, a lot of them felt that the university bore some responsibility for it. And I think by coming out and talking with them, and I think that may have diffused part of it, but a number of them decided to camp out on the North Quad there, which we allowed to proceed for a number of days. I was getting a lot of advice from members of the General Assembly and others about how I ought to send the police in there and take care of those protesters. But we tried to be patient. Milner Ball from the law school, who was very well respected by students across the campus, really became a facilitator for us in terms of trying to work that out. And what we eventually worked out was that they would move to an area there, I guess what would be on the northeast little sliver of campus up there. I didn't want to give the impression that this was, that this was going to be patterned and practiced at the university. That if you needed a place to pitch a tent, you were going to put out in front of Old College. At the same time, I wanted to respect the rights of the students to free speech and protest. So we reached what I think was a pretty good controversy. It was controversial, but a pretty good compromise. And it, it kind of faded out after a while. I think spring break came along, and it never really got reestablished after that. But I think the lesson is the lesson for the administration is not to kind of overreact to something like that, and to be a university about it, engage people in discourse and listen to what they've got to say. And I think the lesson for the students is that not to destroy the university because of exogenous events that are affecting the world. The university becomes a handy, I think in the case of Wisconsin, the university became a handy punching bag for the students, because it was a lot easier to punch at the university than it was to punch at the Department of Defense in Washington. It was just closer. Mm-hmm. And I really, in retrospect, think all that guided my thinking in terms of trying to kind of work through that issue and be patient about.
I remember the day Brooks Hall burned.
Yeah.
You were out of town speaking somewhere, and we called you and said, you need to get back. And I believe you flew over the fire as it was in progress. You recall?
I know exactly where we were. We were at Sapelo on that. Did you ever have the opportunity to land on the grass strip at Sapelo?
No, I did not.
All right. Well, that was a flying experience. Mac McCorder, who was the pilot of the plane we used for entire time I was there, and we were, I can't remember exactly why I was at Sapelo, but it was one of the issues dealing with the Marine station down there and so on, and there was an old landing strip there actually on Sapelo that Mr. Reynolds, when he owned it, one of his ideas was they'd use it as a tourist destination. It was actually an old grass strip and an old Delta office right there, and an old hangar and so on. And I remember we were taxiing down to get it into the wind, because it wasn't an easy place to either land or take off on. And my cell phone went off, and it was Tom Landrum. Well, first of all, I mean, we were literally revving the engines, and the cell phone went off. And I don't know why. Typically I would have just said, I'll get it when I get back to Athens. But I asked Mac to power down the engines so I could hear what was going on the cell phone. And as you said, it was I think you and Tom Landrum on the phone saying, you need to get back here, Brooks Hall's on fire. So we flew back to Athens, and that's why we flew over the fire. Was on the way in, I asked Mac to fly over North Campus, and you could tell it was a catastrophe by that. This was an hour. It takes about an hour to get back from there. So an hour later, a lot of the roof had caved in and so on. I just was as I flew over it, I remember thinking of one thing, and that is, I hope nobody got hurt.
Right.
And it was just property damage in the end. Nobody got hurt.
Rebuilding a facility like that, though, and handling the displacement is a major administrative task.
Well, and with Al Niemai and Bill Procasi, I remember we met the next morning, and we did two things happen. One is, I told Al, I thought about it overnight, and I told Al and Bill, and after we had met, you'll remember this, we walked out in front of Lustra House. There were a lot of reporters there, and I said, we're gonna rebuild this, and we're gonna start right away, period. This wasn't a question of, I wanted to make sure the business college faculty, the Terry College faculty, knew that they had a commitment that this was going to get fixed as soon as possible. The second thing that happened, though, is it doesn't tend to make for a very good news story, but it's a reality around universities I've worked at, and that is that in an event like that, the friction between the arts and sciences faculty and the business college faculty and journalism college faculty, it all just disappeared. Everybody said, all right, here's what we need to do to get this to work, and here's where we need to put the offices, and here's where we need to create classroom space, and so on. And everybody, all the colleges pitched in, everybody gave a little bit. Then we got through the the next year, and I don't know that, it clearly was a traumatic event, but I don't think the Terry College suffered from it in the long run.
Another big management issue I recall is the huge budget hits we had in about 91 and 92.
Yeah.
Particularly cooperative extension.
Yeah.
Took a lot of hits. It pales a bit in comparison to some of what we faced recently, but even so, it was a crisis.
I'd really like to start there, because as we speak today, we're in the middle of a budget situation in the state that makes that all seem like kind of child's play in retrospect. And I really I fear that the situation we're in right now is, I think we got through those couple of budget hits we went through in a way that were significant speed bumps, but basically we were able to maintain the trajectory. What I fear now is that the budget cuts the university is having to take right now are going to significantly and in the long run affect the trajectory of the university. I don't know the details of it, although I'm on the faculty listserv and I get that end of it. But it just seems to me that the level of dollars that have been taken out is just not possible to be able to keep the growth rates in the university going in the right direction.
To date, we've lost 13.9% of the fiscal year 10 budget.
Well, it's not a pretty picture. I think the economy generally, this is June of '09, is on the way back up, but these tax collection issues are going to lag that. And what I'm afraid of is the cuts are what they are, but what I'm afraid of is that it breaks the momentum of the University of Georgia, which I think has continued in the 12 years since I've left, and I just hope and pray that's not the case. Those cuts in 91, 92, which were right when Zell Miller was coming into office, were an interesting time. Two things I remember about that very clearly. One was that as you indicated, the cuts in the Cooperative Extension Service were draconian. I always thought it was ironic that the legislature would go in and cut the Cooperative Extension Service and then howl like crazy when you try to say you can't have a county extension agent in each of the counties across the state. Well, I didn't mean you were going to cut the Cooperative Extension agent in my county seat. So there was a little bit of a disconnect there I had with the distinguished members of particularly the Georgia House about that issue. But the real threat to the university was the number of tenured faculty lines. People don't think of the extension service this way, but in the extension service there were and are a number of tenured faculty lines. And again, it's an example of how the university can pull together. I said, well, look, we're we're not going to lay off faculty, and we're not going to sacrifice. We're not going to furlough or fire tenured faculty. And what we did was we absorbed a large number of those faculty back into the resident instruction, or the A budget of the university. And you'd think that would have caused great disruption in the departments they had to go to, that they would have been mad as hops about the fact that they're getting faculty laid into their department that they didn't hire. There wasn't any of that at all. Everybody understood that that was part of maintaining academic reputation in the university. The other thing I remember about that budget cut was Zell had promised during the election that he would back the initial appropriation for the Georgia Research Alliance. And even with the budget cuts, he met his word on that.
And in the next few years, we had 4 consecutive years of 6% pay increases.
Well, that was actually second term. That would have been 90. I'm thinking I'm trying to get the years straight. His initial election was 90, so this would have been 90, 91. The 4 consecutive years were when he was reelected in 94. And in a story I still tell to new university presidents, as one of those moments that doesn't ever happen in higher education, the governor asked Wayne Clough, who was relatively new at Tech at that point, and I'm trying to think who was at, I guess it was Carl Patton at Georgia State and Fran Tedesco at Medical College. 4 research university presidents met with the governor for lunch between his reelection and his inauguration to his second term. And he said, what can I do to help build the reputation of your institutions? And we said, you can give us 4 consecutive years of 6% salary pools. And he did. He delivered on that, made a huge difference.
I believe the year you arrived, the university raised $14 million in private funds.
Yeah.
And that is a lot higher these days, and you had a lot to do with building the fundraising organization. A capital campaign occurred during your administration. Talk about what it took to build that, and plus an emphasis on public relations, which is important.
Yeah, well, I think it is important to, the dollars are important that you raise, and we were able to, through the campaign and kind of putting in place a professional communications and fundraising presence, we're able to bump that up, ratchet it. I think that's always the objective, is that you go along at a certain level and you have a campaign, you don't want it to slide back down. You want it to continue at an increased level. And we were able to do that. It's an art, not a science. And a lot of people worked hard at that. A lot of volunteers worked hard at it. A lot of good staff. Nick Edis, Don Eastman served as vice presidents for development during that period of time, and a lot of the credit should go to them. But it's basically relationship building. Lynn deserves a lot of credit for that. People didn't see a lot of the things she did. I mean, I remember, of course, the largest single donor, I think, still to the university is Bernie Ramsey. And the development staff that was in place when I came said, well, just don't bother with Bernie. He's just mean and ornery and up in New York and really isn't going to give any money to the university. But I found out that it's a good case, by the way, how athletics can help in fundraising, is that Bill Hartman, Coach Hartman, had him down they had been in the same class, and Bernie was the commandant of ROTC and Bill was the All-American halfback. And Coach Hartman and Ruth would have Bernie down every fall for a football game. So he had maintained some relationship with the university. But when we first started working with him, I thought, the staff that said this is going nowhere were right. But it was actually Lynn who said, I think Bernie has a good heart. I think he loves the university. I think he just, we need to find the right thing to ignite his passion. It's a good case in point about fundraising is we stayed after that. Peter and Kay Amon, Bernie was Merrill Lynch and Peter's Merrill Lynch, and he had developed a relationship with Bernie. too, and several others. And eventually, after gosh knows how many trips to New York and entertaining Bernie in Athens, we got the key. I know when we hit it, we had him at a event out at the Botanical Garden, and somebody, whoever it was, I don't know, and they ought to get their portrait painted at the university. Sat Bernie between two foundation fellows at the dinner, and I remember in the middle of the dinner, Lynn poked me and she said, "Look over at Bernie," and he was just in heaven talking to these young students. And shortly after, he said, "That's what I want to do. I want to build that program." And that's, of course, what he ended up doing. That's where the Ramsey Scholars came from.
An emphasis on development and on institutional public relations that had not been that strong before you came into office, and you put great importance on it.
Well, and Tom, you need to take a lot of the credit for the fact that I think, I came from a background, and presidents are different, and I don't mean this to be critical of anybody that came before me, but there was a little bit of a sense when I got there that she didn't talk to the press and didn't communicate, and I had come from a background where transparency was the norm, basically. Besides the fact that open records laws would make you transparent anyway, but I think you'll agree that what we tried to do was to be accessible to the press and talk with them, and not everybody tries to spin a little bit, but we didn't try to overspin things in terms of our angle on it. And I think with most of the reporters, not all of the reporters, that made a difference, and I think they treated the university on balance better because of that, because they had some confidence that we were giving them the straight information and as much information as we could.
I remember one time you told me that my challenge for the year was to have a University of Georgia research project reported in the New York Times and the Science Times. That happens weekly now, but the first time it happened, you gave us a champagne reception.
Exactly. I remember it. I remember it well. Now I've got to tell you that one of the joys of my current life is that I can go out in the morning and pick up the Atlanta Constitution and know there's an excellent chance I won't be above the fold.
Well, we can't pick it up at all in Athens, so you're doing better.
That's right. That's right.
Now, I remember one day you called me, and my office was 2 doors down from yours, and I was in Terrell Hall, and you were in Lustra House. And you said, "I need you to come here right now," and it sounded urgent. And I went to the office, and I walked in and sat down, and you said, "I need to tell you that Vince Dooley has resigned." And I laughed, and I thought, this is a bad joke. And you said, "No, he really has resigned." And that was a bit of a challenge, going through that change in both the head football coach and the athletic director at the same time.
Yeah, it was. And it surprised me. It didn't surprise me that Vince was stepping down as head football coach, because he and I talked about that a number of times over the first couple of years I was there. And what surprised me was he was stepping down as athletic director at the same time, because if you will recall, he was going to run for governor. That's what he had set out to do. Mm-hmm. So it put us in a kind of a unique situation. I mean, normally, if the head football coach resigns, you turn to the athletic director and say, find a head football coach. And in our case, that wasn't possible. And that was a rocky few weeks. We almost had a coach, and then that popped out with trying to remember the fellow's name, Dick Sheridan. From North Carolina State, and it got leaked prematurely to the papers before he had a chance to tell his team, and he had to pull out. And you always learn from events like that, and I learned from that event. But it was I remember the press conference that followed probably later that day or the next day after you and I discuss what was going on. And it was at the Tate Center, and they broke into, I think, all the TV stations in Georgia live at 2:00 in the afternoon, knocked the soap operas off TV.
You're exactly right.
For Vince to announce his that he was stepping down, and that was where Lynn and I developed the metaphor of trouble, which at that point, I don't know if they do this anymore. I think the technology has changed a bit, but it's, you well know this, Tom. It used to be that when there was big news going on, the satellite trucks from NBC, ABC, and CBS would descend on Athens, and we always knew there was trouble if we woke up in the morning and looked out of the second floor of the president's home, and there were the 3 satellite trucks lined up in front of the house, waiting waiting for trouble.
Some things
and I think
change.
they spent about a week there during that coach's search. It was right over Christmas.
Yes.
The other, in fact, Lynn and I were laughing about this the other day. She still refers to it as the lost Christmas. And people, again, this one is a number of people remember, most people wouldn't, is when we changed coaches between after Ray Goff left. We had hired the coach at the University of Kansas, a guy named Glenn Mason, and he decided on Christmas Day that he wasn't going to come, that he was going to stay at the University of Kansas. And I remember getting a call like 10 o'clock Christmas morning from John Schaefer, who was then associate athletic director, and he said, Vince and Barbara are on their way back from Birmingham, where Barbara's family was. And it's before cell phones, I guess, or why they didn't have a cell phone, I don't know. But he said Vince was going to stop at the first rest stop in Georgia and call you like at 11:20 or something like that. And I thought, uh-oh, because I remember saying to John Schaefer, I said, I assume he's not calling to wish me Merry Christmas. And indeed, we had a couple of discussions as he was trying to get back to Athens, and I remember in the choice between Glenn Mason and in that search, the other candidate had been Jim Donnan, and we decided very quickly to go back to Jim Donnan and had him signed up. I remember telling Vince, I said, sign him up before the 5 o'clock news tonight, so that I learned all this from you. You don't let the news cycle go, so the story is going to be Georgia hires Jim Donnan rather than the other story.
Yeah, your phone call to me that Christmas Day came in the middle of Christmas dinner, and that was the end of Christmas.
Well, it was. Lynn calls it the lost Christmas. She says my mother who at that point was kind of elderly, was sitting at the Christmas dinner table the whole time going, where's Chuck? Where's Chuck? Where's Chuck?
In fact, Coach Dooley came back to you a few weeks later and asked if he could return as athletic director.
In that case, in the former case, which would have been, 89, he did, and I didn't hesitate for a second. I said, the job is yours. We'll cancel the search and move forward. And I think Vince, in my estimation, turned out to be a great athletic director. That doesn't always happen with football coaches that may hold both titles and then become athletic directors. But he was a great athletic director for the University of Georgia.
When people write the story of Chuck Knapp as president at UGA, what points do you hope they make? What are the accomplishments you'd hope to be remembered for during your 10 years?
Rise in academic reputation. I think if they remember that, then the rest of it is detail. I think that's what I was trying to do, and I think we accomplished that, and I think that trajectory continues to this day. I'm very proud of the university. I had a great time. Had 10 great years. I've left at a period in time where I still had other things to do, and I'm still enjoying life, but I'll always look back at that as a kind of a wonderful period, and frankly a period where we set out to do something and got it done.
You served 10 years to the day.
I did.
Was that by design?
No, it was just happenstance. I had begun to think about it's different for different presidents, and I've watched a lot of them over the years, and some the period's shorter and some it's longer. But for me, in that 10th year, we had a strategic plan. We had reached the objectives in a strategic plan, and I remember in that year calling in one by one every dean, every vice president, and saying, all right, what's our new energy source here? We built academic reputation. What do we do next? And coming away from that without in my own mind, although there were a lot of good ideas on the table, without a clear sense of what was next. And then the opportunity at the Aspen Institute came up, and it just worked out that it was 10 years.
So you've been out of office now 12.
I have.
How have you spent the 12 years?
Well, I was at the Aspen Institute for a number of years, and then I ran the higher education practice at Heidrick and Struggles for 3 or 4 years, I guess. And one day I was having lunch with my friend Tom Cousins, who was on the search committee that really Tom was really the principal recruiter in terms of the person I was talking to the most during the search, and we'd maintained a friendship ever since. And I was frankly whining about the amount of travel I was having to do. And this was after 9/11, and it just was difficult to get on and off airplanes 3 times a week. And I was going all over the world with Heidrick, which is a huge search firm in universities dealing with university issues. And he said, well, why don't you just come to the work for our family foundation part-time and do our educational programming. And that sounded like a good deal. And it has been. It's been great. I've morphed from there into chairing the Eastlake Foundation and the revitalization efforts in southeast Atlanta. And we are now just now embarking on an effort to try to take what we've learned from Eastlake to other that model to other cities across the country, and so that's very exciting. I don't think I'm retirable, really. I'll probably just fall off the saddle sometime, and that'll be it. But I can't see myself retiring, at least now.
Well, we thank you. I wonder if there's anything I haven't asked that you
I think I
had asked.
We've had a good discussion. I've enjoyed it. I'm still a bulldog. I want everybody to know I'm a bulldog forever. The last nights over the weekend, and I found myself turning on ESPN2, rooting for the women's softball team.
Yeah.
And their battle out there in Oklahoma City. We take great pride. Lynn and I take great pride in the university and all it's accomplished and continues to accomplish, and it was a great period in our lives.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.